Okay, so we've come a long way in our SLO journey, and we've talked about power standards, learning targets, assessments, and so this next module, which is broken up into two pieces, talks about how you take that assessment data and move it to the next level. This is where a lot of teachers struggle. They start to struggle with, how do I take these numbers from my assessments and actually use them to set goals and targets for my kiddos? So that's kind of where we're headed. So we're going to review, and then I have a 20-page document that I would like you to read and hopefully be able to have the opportunity to discuss as a group. I've used this document in a number of trainings, and it always usually comes to the end of the process like this as we head down towards the data discussion. And what I find fascinating is as teachers and administrators look over this document, they really start to realize that, oh, this is a challenging process. This is a culture shift. This is a mind shift, because it talks about the difference between mastery and proficiency. It talks about tiering students and grading them differently. And it really dips into the philosophy behind standards-based grading a little bit. So it's a big picture item. I want you to take your time and read it. So this is just going to be a quick, short video, and then you'll have that one document to read. So let's review real quick. I want you to take a moment, and I want you to think about a personal life goal that you have, and how it can be one you've set, one you've achieved, and I want you to jot down what the goal did for you before, during, and after, okay? And you might want to think of a quick image or draw a quick image of how that represents you. I'll give you an example. I have always set personal goals in my life, from running to my career to my outside activities from work. I always I'm a list setter. I like to check things off lists. I get pleasure out of reaching goals, okay? And so I always have a process. I always do some planning, and then I do the hard work, and then I celebrate when I achieve that goal. So keep that in the back of your mind. So real quick, write down a personal goal that you have. A lot of times there's themes that come out. So if you're in a group or you're around somebody when you're doing this video, talk about themes that come out in personal goals. What emerges? What can goals do for individuals, and how can they be used as educators? How can they help us? To me, goals set my GPS. They set where I'm headed and for what purpose. Because if I don't know the purpose behind what I'm doing, then I personally struggle. Same when I was a teacher. If I didn't know what the purpose was in my classroom, it was a terrible lesson. And on reflection, I had quite a few of those. So think about or discuss, if you're with a group, what can goals do for you individually, and how can goals help us as educators? Our journey. So like I said, we traveled through power standards and learning targets and assessments. And tonight, you're just going to read a quick article in regards to assessments and how it ties into the student learning student learning objective process. And then when we come back next month, you'll learn how to use the template that I have for you and how to plan the process from start to finish. So just as review, SLOs are the reason why goal setting is so important. It's based on standards and curriculum. It's meant to help inform instruction and promote student learning. And we recently just finished up monitoring and measuring and talking about assessment. So we've talked about monitoring, and now we're moving into the measuring portion of this conversation. And I do want to point out this box down here, and it's the why. It can be used for evaluation purposes, but I like to talk about the best practice in instruction. So recently I was at a meeting, a statewide meeting, talking about SLOs, and Traverse Bay, who's been assisting a number of us, we've kind of teamed up. As you can see, for example, on this slide, you have Wayne Risa, Traverse Bay, and ourselves. When we're talking about student learning objectives, my biggest struggle is we automatically want to jump to the numbers. We want to get that testing data, set that target, and then measure it and look for student growth. There's a huge process missing before it, and that's what I've been able to cover with you. So you have the standards and curriculum. Okay, so you have your power standards, You have your learning targets and the instruction going on that blends into assessment with pre, formative, and post. And in the middle of that, in that whole process, you can design student learning objectives. So let's take a quick reflection moment and think about the journey you've traveled. From power standards to learning targets to assessments, what are some things you have encouraged teachers or yourself to stop doing in your building? What are some things that you think you want to continue doing? And what are some things you are going to start doing based on what you've learned so far through these modules? So just take a quick moment, jot it down or write a conversation. So as we head into this next piece that takes that assessment data and digs deeper into it, I want you to think about what are the most important knowledge and skills you want your students to obtain by the end of interval of instruction. I love that phrasing, interval of instruction, because as I've met with some of your staff and as we've talked, there's this debate as to how long you should have these learning objectives. And I hate putting specific timeframes on things. That's why I like interval of instruction, because to me, it could be a 3-day lesson. It could be a 7-day unit. It could be a 6-week marking period, a semester, a year long. I've seen it done in many, many forms. So think of it as interval of instruction or chunk of learning. Where are my students now at the beginning of instruction with respect to where I want them to be? That is really, really important. And that's why the pre and post assessment process needs to be there. And then based on what I know about my students, where do I expect them to be by the end of the interval of instruction? And how will they demonstrate their knowledge? So my favorite line in this bullet is what I know about my students. The article you're going to read is going to talk a lot about this, because the reality of it is we have different ranges of students with different ranges of ability in all of our classrooms. They are not going to grow the same no matter what type of instruction you do, because they're so individualized. So you really need to know your students and base your objective on groups of students. You may feel you have a pretty homogeneous class. You could set a learning objective for that class. You may have a very distinct class where, for example, 50% are special ed, 50% are general ed, and you want to track the data separately. So there are options with how you track your students and what the expectations are for your students based on their ability. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with this article. Actually, it's more of a process talking about assessments and what you do with the data. I love this article when I give it to teachers because it's very, very intense and it gets them really thinking about data. But as you read it, think about key points or notes in the lesson. Think about parts that you really like or don't want to forget. And then finally, questions that you have. So we're doing what's called lifting lines. You're going to read this piece and you're going to lift lines out of it. And when you get a chance, you can do one of two things. You can either post your thoughts in the Google Classroom, or I believe you guys are going to talk as an administrative team at some point. So those are your two options moving forward. Okay. If you want, here's a protocol that you can use if you're meeting as a group called first turn, last turn. The first person in the group shares a key point or interest or question that they have and provides the location in the reading and reads it out loud. Then each group member takes a turn and it goes around the table giving feedback, opinions, thoughts about the point lifted. But there's no cross-talking, which means everybody gets the floor once and everybody has to actively listen as they're speaking. Then once it comes around to the first person, that first person then reflects on what was said about the key point that they lifted out. And you continue this process until everyone has had a turn. You don't have to use this, but it may be beneficial if you're discussing this in a group because it's a pretty intense piece of reading.